Well, today in the shop, we're going to make a CPM D2 camp knife. So typically I am very bad at videoing things that I'm doing in the workshop, but I will try to make a better effort on it today. So this guy is going to be a nice little camp chopper for just tasks around the campsite, and I'm going to choose to make it out of CPM D2, which is going to be, I think, a very good steel for a blade with this length, which is going to be about 9 inches. So let's get to it. Got her already drawn out here, so let's go cut her out. Well, I'm not having much luck. That blade is having a really hard time cutting that D2, so I'm going to do the rest of the profiling on the grinder. Just going to switch over to 120 grit belt just to get the grain pattern a little finer, make it easier to see my marks when I'm etching. Alright, well there's our rough profile shaped. Feels pretty good in the handle. It's hard to tell with the splint on my finger, but I think that feels pretty good. So now we find the marker. Alright, caliper. Make sure we're zeroed. So 4 point, yeah, we'll say basically 5 millimeter stick, so we need to set 2.5 here. There we go, now we got our center line scribed. So I'm going to grind to there. And I want to be about a half height grind, similar to where I marked here. So scratch that in. So it's about 19 mils. There, you can see that good enough now. Now it's back to the grinder for the rough grinding. Alright, first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to really abruptly grind that down to my line there with this older 36 grit belt. And then after that I'll move on to a fresh belt so I'm not stripping things off, basically breaking the abrasive on that sharp edge. Alright, so now I've got that down to under, I'd say that's about the thickness of a dime. So I'm going to try to keep it about that thickness until after heat treat, and then I'll grind that edge thinner after that. But for now I'm going to grind those bevels down to here. But at first I'm going to switch out to a fresh 36 grit blade. And to start with for this one, I'm going to be using my jig here. So help me keep things a little bit more even. And I could change the angle with this bolt here. There's the first side done. Alright, so there's the bevels roughed in. Now I'm going to get the rest of it up to 120 grit and then top off at 220 grit before I do heat treat. Alright, so there's rough grinding, pretty much done pre-heat treat. However, that edge got very, very thin, so I'm going to have to grind it back just a hair so it's not a danger to work with. Now we're down to about the thickness of a playing card. So we should be good to foil this up and get her heat treated. Although I still gotta drill a few holes and do my jimping. You'll also notice that this blade quickly roughs at this point, similar to a carbon steel. Now D2 is not really a carbon steel or stainless steel. It kind of sits in that mystery category in between of tool steels. So especially in its unhardened state like this, even a lot of the stainless steels like Nitro V and 440 will actually rust at this point. They're not really stainless until they're hardened. Alright, so now it is time to sketch where our handle is going to be. I'm going to want the handle to come up to roughly about there, something like that. So I'll probably put my first Corby bolt about here. I'm going to put another one, I'll move it back about here. Normally I would be a little bit farther down, but I do want to have a nice big hole here in order for lanyard loops, so that's what I'm going to put there. So these are going to be drilled to 7/16, which is going to accept the Corby bolts. And this, I'm not sure what size yet. I'll see what tube stock size I have. First thing before I forget, I'm going to put a sharpening choil in right here. So this basically just prevents the sharpening stone from scratching things up, makes it a little bit easier to sharpen because the bolster area doesn't really catch on the stone. So nice and easy to do it now while the steel is still soft. And that's all it takes. Now onto the jimping. If I can find my jimping file. This little guy here cuts 20 lines per inch, so makes perfect jimping. There we go. Jimping cut in. Gives you a little bit extra thumb grip on there, and also for scraping a fire steel, it can really help with that. Alright, on the holes. Alright, so back to marking holes. I'm going to be here. I want to be slightly above my center line because these still need to be finished ground, but I'm going to do those later after heat treatment. Those are going to get refined. There's not too much point doing them now because I got to grind them again after heat treating and putting the scales on anyways. So these guys, I just got to mark. Now off to the drill press. So first I'm going to drill the 7/32 size holes for the Corby bolts. 1/4" for the lanyard tube. And then there's going to be a couple of 1/4" holes I'm going to put in here, and that just helps to glue bond between both sides, as well as lightens things up a little bit. But this is going to be a pretty heavy use chopper knife, so I don't want to lighten it up too much. Now I just got to bevel those edges. There we go, now that's looking pretty good. Now because my bit here is a little dull, it has raised an edge there, so I'm going to grind that off. Then we're going to hit this whole thing with a surface conditioning belt, and we're going to be ready for heat treat. Alright, so that's been gone over with the surface conditioning belt now, so it's about 220, 240 grit kind of on average, so let's get it wrapped up and into the oven for heat treat. Alright, that's all wrapped up in stainless steel foil, ready to go in. I've actually never worked with CPM D-2 before, so I'm going to follow Dr. Lanyard Thomas's recommendations on it pretty much exactly. I don't do cryo because I'm not set up with liquid nitrogen here at the moment, so I'm going to use his recommendation to use 1850 degrees Fahrenheit without cryo for 30 minutes soak time before plate quenching. So that should get me on this chart. If I do 1850 and a 400 degree temper, I should be roughly 61 1/4 Rockwell, so that's good. This is going to be a fairly big knife for rough use, so I want it to be fairly tough as well, so it should be good and tough, but we'll see. So in she goes. Okay, while that is in there getting up to temperature, we're at about 1400 degrees now. Let's get this guy split up and turned into some handle scales. Alright, we have been at temperature for 30 minutes now, so it is ready to come out and be quenched. How she looks. Basically down to 120 Fahrenheit from 1850 in about a minute. Looks nice and straight. Let's cut her open and take a look. There we go. Looks like there wasn't any too serious of oxygen leaks in there. Normal hardening colors. See if she's hard. Skates the file nicely. So now we're going to be into the freezer for a couple hours for poor man's cryo. Now the even heat is coming up to temperature, and this guy has finished his cold treatment. So in he goes twice for 2 hours at a time. And then we should be at our final Rockwell hardness, and we'll test it then. Tempering cycle is now complete, so I can get this puppy out to cool down, and then we can move on to finish grinding. Alright, well here it is after heat treatment, so nice and straight. Typically, if your edge gets this thin, you can sometimes have some problems with it warping or curling in heat treatment. It didn't seem to have any problems with it that time, although it was thinner than I usually comfortable with. And because of that, I don't need to do a whole lot of finish grinding. Oxidation wasn't too bad, so I'm just going to try hitting this with a 400 grit belt before I move on to the disc sander. Now I'm going to use a Trizact belt, which is a structured abrasive. Alright, I thought maybe I'd go for the machine finish on this guy, but there's a couple spots I'm not super happy with. Right there, I got a little bit of a nick there. I can take that out with hand sanding, but pretty difficult to make that out without making a bigger mistake with the belt grinder. Same thing on this side here, just got a little too greedy right in that corner there. So I'm just going to blend that in, I think, with some hand sandpaper. I've never hand sanded CPM D-2, so I guess we'll see how that goes. Alright, so here's the first side, and it's been partially hand sanded. Got to find a spot where the light is. It's probably difficult to see, but you can see these vertical scratches here. And with a machine finish, these probably would have blended in, and that's one of the reasons why I really like hand sanding, because I'm a bit of a perfectionist. You see right along the edge here is probably still some 220 scratches. Not many, but there's some there. You can see a little spot right there where I probably bit with the edge of the belt. And I haven't sanded too much towards the tip yet, but you can see a bunch more scratches there. I've got this part, the back of the blade, fairly good. Still just have to blend that in there, just a hair, and then start on the second side. So this side hasn't been done at all. You can see you got a little waviness going on right there. So I won't show too much of this because it is very time consuming. Before I hand sand this one, before I hand sand this side, I'm going to use my disc grinder with 600 grit. Just lightly along the bevels to kind of take off some of those high spots, hopefully save me some time hand sanding. However, I do have to be very careful with my old disc sander because there's no directional control or speed control. So it's full tilt all the time, and you can get out of control with it pretty easily. Alright, so it doesn't look like much yet, but that should have smoothed things out a little bit more, taken off some of those high spots. Should save me some time hand sanding. Alright, I've got the whole blade up to 400 grit now on both sides, and it's looking pretty good. I'm not going to go any higher than 400 grit. I would normally go to 800, but because this is going to be a rough use camp knife, it's going to show scratches real bad if I go to too fine of a finish on it. So I'm going to do 400, and then the buffer, and then we're on to etching. Well, after buffing, a quick wipe down with some brake cleaner shows it is looking pretty good. It doesn't look like I missed any of the vertical scratching. Everything's nice and horizontal. Buffer shined things up nicely. So now we are on to etching before we start on the handle. Alright, so on to etching. I do have some nice vinyl stickers I could use for this, but I find I kind of don't like them because I get more of a personalized touch. Everyone's a little bit different. So I'm going to, if I use, yeah. Well, on to etching. I do have some nice vinyl stickers that I could apply on here to do my touch mark, but I find more and more that I kind of like the personalized differences I get when I do it by hand. And I mean, runic markings are designed to be easy and straightforward to do by hand, which is part of the reason why I've always used it as my touch mark. So I'm going to apply electrical tape onto the blade, cut it out with this, and then move on to the etching. The important thing when you do this is starting with a very clean blade. So in this case, I have basically washed it in paint thinner and brake cleaner. If you don't have a clean blade, the electrical tape will not stick quite well enough, and you'll end up with pinholes and kind of just a crappy looking etching where the tape doesn't stick. So you need to make sure that you have done a very good job degreasing and over apply your tape, because you don't really want your electrolyte solution to splatter off where you're etching and put pits in your blade after you've buffed it. I like to do this after buffing, because if you buff after doing the etching, you kind of remove some of the black burn kind of looking area out of the etching, and you kind of lose a bit of your contrast. Stupid finger brace gets in my way and makes this a little bit more difficult as well. Ripped the tendons off my finger there on the end a couple weeks ago, and I still have a couple more weeks left to go before I can take the thing off. So my L looks a little fucked up now because of that. Now, of course, you got to be careful you don't touch the surface with your fingertips where you're removing the electrical tape. So that little bit of finger grease will give you grief. There we go, ready for etching. And as far as etching goes, you don't need anything too crazy complicated. I, for example, just using a Motomaster Eliminator 12 volt 2 amp trickle charger hooked up to a pair of alligator clips. One end goes here, and the other end I'm going to be using a Q-tip soaked in saltwater solution, and that will do a pretty damn good job. Been doing it for years. You can really see it sizzling. It's important to not do it for more than a couple seconds. It can get quite hot actually, which will kind of screw up your electrical tape or your vinyl, whichever you're using. So go slow, you know, a second or two, remove, go somewhere else, let that heat dissipate a little bit. Doesn't take too terribly long. This will do a pretty deep etch pretty quickly. That's about all she needs. Wipe off the excess liquid before it gets where we don't want it to go. It will etch into steel by itself quite quickly, even without power. Alright, now we'll remove our tape. And you can see that is etched in very nicely. Deep enough, it'll catch your fingernail easily. Now we just have to neutralize that. So for that, I just use a little bit of the CRC glass cleaner. Make it a little bit easier, wipe some of those salts away. And then we want to make sure we do a pretty good clean on there, make sure we get all that excess salt off. Now I know this camera has pretty poor macro view, but you can see it right there, looking pretty good. So now we're on to handle. Now at this point I like to wrap the blade with paper towel and some tape just to keep things protected and safe while I'm working around it with machines. So let's get that done. There we go, all protected up. Alright, and here's my handle block. I've marked both sides as outside. They fit nice and flat together. They've been flattened using 120 grit belt on the flat platen. So they fit really nice, and I'm pretty happy with that. And I want this glow in the dark strip to basically be running right down the center of the handle so I don't lose it. So I think it's going to be sitting something like that. So that should work pretty good. I'd like to have maple both on the bottom and the top of the handle with that strip running down the middle. So now we need to get these guys kind of glued together so that we can do some shaping and hole drilling. So first thing, coat the inside layer, some good quality masking tape. This allows us to glue them together without actually physically gluing the wood to each side. Makes it easier to separate after we're done. Make sure we're matched up again. And a clamp and a little dab of crazy glue. Let that sit for a minute or two and harden up. Alright, so now I got my scale marked. This is left, outside, front, and back. And I want to be fairly close to the top here. So I'm going to go about there. I'm going to mark where my holes are going to be for right now. Okay. If you don't have one of these Pika Deep markers, precision marker, these things are absolutely awesome for knife making. You can get into some really tight spots. Way better than a Sharpie for certain things. Now my holes are marked. We'll take this over to the drill press. Alright, now we fit together quite nicely. Tube through there. Into the block. You tap this through just lightly. I just want to make sure that I'm getting it into both layers of wood so nothing can shift around on me. There we go. Switch my bit over to 7/32. What did I say this was? 7/32, correct. This will be for the inner diameter of the Corby bolt. That 1/4 inch pin is going to help everything stay in place while I do this. Use an extra drill bit that I have kicking around specifically for this purpose. Pin those guys in place, and then I can drill the front hole. Always try your best to make sure everything is as level as possible at this stage. Now, while this is all still stably pinned together, marker on the outside. And now I've got a template I can cut out of on the bandsaw. Alright, so that is now roughed out. I stayed a little ways away from the lines just to give me a safety margin during glue up, basically. And you can see I did manage to get the epoxy pretty well lined up where I want it to be, so that should be pretty good. And I got about roughly 45-degree bevel put in there on both sides. One side is thicker than the other, so it looks a little funny. That's due to my bad bandsaw technique. So now, get this in the vise and get her finished up. Alright, that is now polished up to 3000 grit. You can see the maple looks really good. The epoxy looks good too, but you can just see a bunch of tiny little pinholes in there. And that's because I didn't have a pressure pot when I was casting this. I haven't got that far in my epoxy casting technology yet. But I think my finish will cover over those and you'll hardly even see it. So now we can go ahead and break these guys apart. Normally I would use a liner on a knife like this, whether it's a vulcanized fiber liner or something like G10 or micarta. But on this one I didn't really want to take away from the glow-in-the-dark effect of the epoxy with, you know, distracting other color. So I decided not to go for the liner on these, so hopefully I don't regret it. Alright, now it's time to drill our oversized holes on these for the Corby bolts. And this is the stepped bit that I use for this, so that smaller portion at the end is the same 7/32 as the pilot holes that I already drilled. And the larger size, I want to say, is, what was it, 11/32? 8 millimeters anyways. So that'll fit the body of the Corby bolt and give it a shoulder to sit on. Alright, we're now ready for glue up, so I have kind of roughed up the surface of this here a little bit, there, here and there with the Dremel and our diamond bit. And I've also gone over it with 150 grit up to about here, which is going to get covered over by the handle scales. So both sides are ready for glue up and been degreased. I'm going to be using the Ecopoxy C-Tough for this. If you've never used the CEC Corp epoxy, it is really good. This stuff never really gets brittle. It always stays a little bit rubbery, which means it gives you a very, very tough, durable bond with the handle. So it is a little bit amber colored, but it doesn't really matter too much for what I'm doing. If you needed a really clear epoxy, the CEC 30 is crystal clear. And this is a little 3D printed stand, which I had a friend make up for me, and it basically just allows my epoxy to sit and settle down to the bottom where I'm going to use it. Alright, now as a general rule of thumb, you do not want to get epoxy on the threads of your Corby bolts, but I do like to get a little bit in the hole so that the body is kind of glued in. You don't need a lot, just a little drop. Now I can torque down these bolts a bit. You don't want them really screaming tight, but you want them tight enough to have eliminated any of your gaps. A little bit of acetone on a rag. I'll wipe that area clean. Much easier to wipe it off when it's wet than try to scrape it off when it is dry. And now, because that's 24-hour epoxy, we're going to stop working on this today and come back to it later. Alright, we are now the next day. All the epoxy is nicely hardened up, so now it is time to get this trimmed up on the belt sander. So first thing I'm going to do is use a 36 grit belt just to make sure these are nice and flat and true. Grind down the pin or the lanyard tube on the ends and then shape it to conform to the handle along the back. I might do a little bit of shaping there. Get the handle sides even as far as measurements go, one side to the other. And then I'll do the shaping on the sides, and then I'll run through 120, 220. I'll use my small wheels attachment to clean these out, and then we'll do some hand finishing from there. Alright, so there is my rough shaping done. So this steel is a little on the thicker side than I would normally use. This is 5/32, and the handle scales are about 8.5 millimeters per side, so it's a nice girthy feel in the hand. Looking not too bad. So these are just kind of rough ground in right now, 36 grit. So now I'm going to come in here with a fine rasp. I'm going to kind of fix any mistakes I made. I like to do a lot of my handle shaping by hand, so this is about as far as I ever go on the belt sander. The rest of it is going to be done by rasp and sandpaper. Alright, so that is now polished up to 3000 grit. I'm not going to use the buffer on this like I normally would on straight wood, just because I know that resin can be pretty sensitive to temperature, and if it catches on the buffing wheel just wrong, you're back to sanding again. So from here it is just going to get wax. This is my own wax that I have formulated. It is now going to be for sale at Nexus Grinders, as well as directly through me at Loki's Forge. So it is beeswax, carnauba wax, and mineral oil. So it both penetrates into wood plus leaves the wax on the surface. The carnauba wax will give it a really nice tough finish as it dries. There we go, that is shaping up real nice. You can see how glossy it is now that I've polished that in with just a dry piece of shop towel. So pretty happy with that. Now let's see how well it glows. Take it outside, let it charge up for a minute or two. Oh, there we go. We're not even fully dark in here. You can see that glows really nice. Alright, now the next step, I've decided I'm going to do a Kydex sheath for this. Normally I would do leather for a hunting knife, but for this one I'm just going to do Kydex. It'll be a little quicker, easier. Typically takes me pretty much an entire evening or so to make a leather sheath. Kydex, pretty much quicker. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tape off the blade so that it gives me a little bit of extra space on the Kydex. It won't fit quite so tight, and it also kind of helps minimize scratches on the blade during the process. Alright, so there's my piece of Kydex. So I'm going to come about that far up. I'll have some extra I can cut off here just to kind of help shape that area a little bit, and should work good. Let's get this in the oven. Well, Kydex is pretty much ready to come out of the oven now, so it's been in there at 300 degrees for about 5 minutes, and you generally want it to come out feeling somewhat like a floppy lasagna noodle. Clamp down. Alright, we'll come back in 10 minutes, see how that looks. Alright, it's been about 10 minutes, let's see how she looks. Alright, that looks pretty good. See the outline of the blade. Decent definition around the handle here. Might want to push that in just a hair. Other than that, well, that's probably going to get trimmed off anyways, so that is looking good so far. So now I can trace on about where I want my outside of my sheath to be. Probably something about like that. Do 2 holes right here just in case I'm not happy with how my other sheath attachment method goes. Give me an option there. You can get pretty careful with these and really measure them in. I never really do. I kind of just eyeball it, but to each their own. Alright, let's get some holes drilled. Then of course you need to give her a quick shot of compressed air, make sure there's nothing hiding inside there. Alright, now I got my holes drilled, I can really kind of dial in exactly where I want to cut with the bandsaw. Get things a little bit closer. I want to be kind of a uniform distance from the holes. I can kind of tune that in a little bit with the grinder as well. There we go. Time for another shot of compressed air. Alright, time to do the rivets. Alright, now I'm going to get this guy attached. And then I'm going to heat all this up with the heat gun, get some adjustments made. That put in there. Pull this back out a little bit. Now with that popsicle stick underneath the bolts there, I should have plenty of clearance between the handle material and the head of those bolts. This will give a little bit of a thumb rest here. Might even get that moved out a hair more. Now let's let her sit for a few minutes and cool down again. Alright, let's see. Oh yeah, that slides in nice now. Oh yeah, that's perfect. Good retention. Things in there nice. Beauty. Happy with that. Alright, now we're on to sharpening. Now I know this camera is really bad at macro, but that edge is already just about sharp. So it's going to take very little effort to get this thing sharp. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take it to the belt sander and I'm going to set about a 25-degree angle just on 120 belt. And then I'm going to come and use stones for the rest of it. That should have pretty much got it. Don't see any flat spots or shiny spots, so I think I pretty much have an edge on there now. So now it's over to the stones. Alright, so for sharpening, I'm going to start with this DMT diamond plate. This side is 325 grit. The opposite side is about 1200-ish. So that's how I'm going to do this by hand. And after that, we're going to move on to stropping. Alright, so there's the D2 at about a 1200 grit. One thing I've always loved about D2 is it takes a really nice toothy edge pretty quick. So it's pretty much already just barely shaving sharp. Oh yeah, actually it is shaving sharp. So let's just take a piece of paper, we'll see if there's any spots I missed. Yeah, seems like it cuts pretty evenly. Doesn't seem to be any burrs it's hanging up on, so now we can go straight to stropping. We'll get it really sharp. My strop here is one that I made myself. It's 3-sided, so I got 3.5 micron, 1 micron, and 0.5 micron that I use just for finishing, and this is all diamond paste. Alright, let's give this a try, see how smooth she cuts now. You can just hear by how that cuts, how fine of an edge that is. Should shave real nice. Yep. Alright, let's get it cleaned up. Alright, now both the sheath and the knife are all shined up, so why don't we have some fun and see what this thing can do. Alright, let's see if we can do the old paper tube slash. Oh, I didn't give it quite enough length. I sliced through just on the tip, so there's just a little bit left uncut. So Well, let's try her again. There we go. Nice clean cut that time. Alright, now how about a 2x4 chop? And my vise is in kind of a shitty spot for this, but let's give her a try. Now I gotta stop. It's trying to rip my finger brace off, and I need to heal that ligament right now. So, but it is definitely quite effective. Considering my poor striking skills with my finger brace on, that is doing pretty good. So let's see if it's still sharp. Yep, still doing quite nicely. Once again, I just nicked it. Let's try that again. There we go. Did a good job on that one. Alright, there it is, all done and ready to go, shined up nicely. So this project I just did over Easter weekend here. It has basically taken me 3 days of shop time. I'm not sure how many hours, I wasn't exactly keeping track. Plus it took me about 2 evenings to get this handle block made a couple of weeks ago. So all in all, there's about five-ish days worth of shop time in this build. So hope you like it. By the time I edit this video, it'll probably be long gone. But in case it's not, drop me a line. I can always make another.